You're going to get to a point where there's tens of thousands of chains. Question then becomes how many of those are actually valuable? But definitely you're going to have tens of thousands of chains because people are going to need more demand than what one chain can provide.
Marc Boiron is CEO at Polygon Labs. Polygon Labs, a global blockchain development company building Ethereum scaling solutions like Polygon POS, zkEVM, and AggLayer, and incubating new projects like Katana network aimed at advancing next generation blockchain infrastructure.
Let's take the next 3 to 5 years. How is law going to intersect with DeFi?
I think we've reached the point where DeFi within unregulated users is something that has become accepted. So really the interesting question is, what does DeFi look like when regulated people broadly want to come into DeFi? I think there's zero doubt that you are going to need to have permission pools.
Hello, Mark, and welcome to Alpha Unashed.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Mark, let's dive in with a 10-year perspective. What do you think will be the infrastructure level scenario in 10 years time frame? How many blockchain networks will be there?
Yeah. So I think if you fast forward in 10 years, I always describe it as like the decision-making process for somebody who is going to start a new business. What's going to happen is that right now, when you start a new business, what you do is you go and you decide what infrastructure do I need to host, XYZ. And it might be your website, it must be some server. And you're like, hey, do I use Google Cloud or AWS or something like that? I think when you get to 10 years from now, what's actually going to happen is somebody's going to start a business and they're going to have this decision-making process. Is this going to exist on a blockchain or is it not? That's going to be like their first fork. And that is then reflective of my view on how many chains. What's going to happen after that is most people are going to go and they're going to say, hey, I've got a small business. I can exist on a chain that shares block space with other chains, and they'll just go on an existing chain based on some decision. And those chains are probably going to be very specific to a purpose. So if they're a payments application, they might say, hey, I'm going to go to Polygon POS because it's great for payments. And if I'm a DeFi chain, I might go to Katana. If I'm a DeFin chain, I might go, or a DeFin application, I might go somewhere else. And then there's going to be those who are like, hey, I'm a much bigger business, or I've grown out of this, and now I actually need my own chain, right? And you're going to get to a point where there's tens of thousands of chains. And the question then becomes how many of those are actually valuable. But definitely you're going to have tens of thousands of chains because people are going to need more demand than what one chain can provide.
So you're in the camp that believes that it's going to be certainly a multi-chain future. And by multi-chain, I don't mean 7, 8 top chains, but it's going to be hundreds of chains. I mean, one can understand very specific custom chains or which are, for example, serving a specific need or a compliance requirement and stuff like that. But other than that, you still think that it's going to be a real multi-chain universe in 10. It's not the reverse direction where there'll be a consolidation and there may be just 8, 10 top chains really. And, there could be app chains with specifics derived from them, but there may be only 7, 8 top chains at best.
Yeah, I mean, I think, everything kind of follows Pareto principles, right? So you're going to have a few chains that are going to end up doing a lot of the volume. But we already have hundreds of chains today. Now, most of those chains probably shouldn't exist. How many general purpose chains that do the same things are necessary? But even if you remove that and you just look at how many chains today are built for a purpose that actually makes sense, you're already at dozens of those that actually exist, right? You look at Abstract on the consumer side, you look at Katana on the DeFi side, you look at Polygon POS for payment specific things. And I could keep going on about the chains that make sense that they exist. And so you're definitely going to be in the dozens of chains that exist, probably even the hundreds. And then you add on, and I don't think we can exclude those, right? You need to add on those that are there for compliance reasons. They need something specific, or they just want block space built in a very specific way to create a very specific user experience. they're going to want to control that experience fully, and they're going to want to own that block space. So I think you get to, when you think of chains with like broadly shared state, let's call them general purpose chains. Yeah, I think you probably have a handful of those that exist that are doing like most of the volume of that type. But actually where I think most of the volume ends up existing is like specific chains for a purpose, chains that exist for payments, chains that exist for DeFi. That's actually where you end up seeing most of it, because you can actually build something specific for that purpose. And then what's going to happen is as chains come there, or as apps come there, they're going to grow out of that chain. They're going to say, hey, it was great being here, but I can create a better user experience somewhere else. We already see this happen, by the way, right? So like, I think of a good example being, I think one of the best examples to point to actually is Solana ecosystem, right? Because Ethereum's already had so many chains that like apps that like leave Ethereum to go elsewhere. So it's like very easy to point to hundreds of those. But Solana, the general thesis is you don't need to go anywhere but on Solana. But then you look at how many chains use the SVM, but then still like settle on kind of like the AggLayer. So I'm trying to think. I think it might be called Atlas, right? It's a perp dex. I can't remember. Phoenix, I think, is the perp dex on Solana. They are building their own SVM based chain that they announced settling on Ethereum. That is a great example of what happens. They go there. They're like, hey, we can actually do well here, but we can build an even better product on our own chain, and they leave. We're going to see so much of that, and that's why you're going to have thousands of chains ultimately.
So you've been sort of, before being CEO of Polygon Labs, you were the chief legal officer there, and at some point you were the chief legal officer at DYDX as well, right? And DYDX spawned out with their own chain, I think on was it Polka? And we've sort of more recently seen Uniswap also do that. Now, in hindsight, were those the right decisions? As CEO of one of the large, chain ecosystems, what's your view?
Yeah, so I think it all depends on like, there's never going to be like one right answer. So, DYDX effectively was on Starkware as an L2, and then left and built its Cosmos-based chain. And then basically what we've seen is Hyperliquid come and beat it. I think there's like a couple reasons you could look at that. First is you shouldn't underestimate the difficulty of like moving liquidity and starting up a new chain. It's actually like very, very difficult in an environment where you don't actually control kind of like distribution users. So it's very different to say, hey, PayPal has an app that exists on chain A, and now PayPal's going to go create its own chain. PayPal will literally funnel every single one of its users to that new chain with zero issue whatsoever. But in a completely permissionless environment where you're like, hey, I'm shutting down this chain, you can now go anywhere. And here's this alternative, which in DYDX's case was a worse product, not a better product, right? It was a more decentralized product, but from a user experience perspective, it was a worse product. So people start looking at what are other options. And it just happens that Hyperliquid has this perfect timing where it's like, oh, right as DYDX v3 is going to be transitioning, here comes Hyperliquid. I think that in a different world where that timing is different, it doesn't look that way. But I think it really comes down to DYDX created like an inferior product, even though it was more decentralized. Now, whether they can come back to what they were, I wouldn't like bet against that team, but that makes sense as to like why that was a struggle, right? And then you look at something like Uniswap. Uniswap makes way more sense. They're deployed on many, many different chains. And what they're basically needing to solve for now is a liquidity issue that exists across all of these chains, right? They bring in Uniswap X as kind of a solution to that problem. But the thing is, when you're using any cross-chain solution or any aggregation solution, you're still limited by the deepest liquidity that exists in any one place. And so if you want to create the best trading experience, which is really what Uniswap is focused on, what you need to do is focus on creating a environment that allows for that. So if they don't have their own chain, now what they're subject to is an app. And people now have different experiences on that app based off of what chain they're actually using. So Uniswap can try to create one uniform experience, and it can do a pretty good job, but it's still limited by the underlying chains. On top of that, the liquidity that is shared ends up being limited by liquidity. So if they have their own chain, they can now control one consistent user experience. Obviously, they're still on other chains. They still claim they'll be on other chains for forever. I don't actually see that happening. I think if you fast forward a few years, that's no longer the truth. We'll see whether that's true or not. And then second is now they can create much deeper curated liquidity within their own chain, which is a very similar approach to, us having incubated Katana at Polygon Labs and the approach that we're taking there. And so for me, like that makes a lot of sense. And you've seen very good growth on Unichain. And I think the user experience on Unichain is probably better, or at least more consistent than the user experience that you get on many other chains using Uniswap.
Right. So obviously there's no one direction. And again, this space is evolving fast and we'll see how it emerges. And in many ways, at Polygon itself, you guys have kind of transitioned through some of, navigating some of these challenges. At one time being very enterprise focused, taking some very, what at that point in time, or even today, and even in hindsight, were pretty progressive steps. But in some sense, building traction on those has been difficult or challenging. And I think that's something you also voiced in your leadership role. And then you guys have now sort of come back home to the world of DeFi with Katana. I mean, the whole. Let's talk about Katana. What's been the thinking, and if you kind of start by taking a step back in terms of the transition from where Polygon was headed, how it was there, and how you and Sandeep, what were the dynamics like when you steered it towards Katana, and let's talk about Katana then.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because a lot of people look at what Polygon did back in 22 and 23 around enterprises, and half of them laugh. Now look at today, what's happening, and it looks prescient at that point in time. But you have to go back and ask yourself, actually, how would this have turned out if 3AC and FTX blowing up had not happened? And I actually think it would have happened very, very differently, because what we know at Polygon is the momentum around that was actually incredibly high. And what you could see, it's funny, you look at ETPs. Right? Like ETFs are the big thing. You go look, Polygon had an ETP in almost every region of the world back in 23 already. If FTX had not happened, I think that easily transitions into what you're seeing today. So I think that's one kind of thing that's interesting, is what would the world have looked like without FTX? And I think that's for a lot of people, frankly. But once that did happen, what became very evident is the reality of enterprises coming on chain was delayed by 2 to 3 years, right? It now turns out that it looks like probably about 2 years. So that required Polygon to reinvent itself and go from a very enterprise and institutions focused company to being able to go back to relating to kind of the more Web3 focused use cases. But one thing that we did that was, I think, pretty smart is we never let go of those institutions and enterprises. So we've always had, as an example, RWAs. If you go look anywhere at the number of RWAs on a chain, what you'll see is Ethereum and Polygon at the very top of that, because we've never stopped actually focusing on those use cases. And same thing with payments, which requires the institutional relationships. We've never really let go of those. Where we focused less was enterprises, but never focusing less on institutions. And that's partially because we knew that institutions would naturally flow into the core of what you do in Web3, because it's all financial. And so they're naturally going to flow into that. The question was just when, not if. Whereas enterprises were always a little more of an if. And I think that's still true, right? If you look at big enterprises, the Starbucks and the Nikes, what are they doing in Web3 right now? Actually, you still don't see them really doing anything in Web3 right now. And so I think that continued focus on institutions while dropping the enterprises ended up kind of looking like the right move. The other thing that we did at that time was recognize this multi-chain world. So a lot of the conversation that we just had around the hundreds and thousands of chains, there's all an underlying premise that we haven't talked about that's really important, which is that you will be able to go between these chains securely, cheaply, and fast. If you can't do that, then this world of thousands of chains and tens of thousands of chains like can't exist, because being on one chain and not being able to go do something on another chain is just not, it's the reality we basically live in today. It's not the reality that's going to onboard, everyone into crypto in general. And it's definitely going to prefer one shared state over specific block space that can be built. And so that's why we started building what we refer to as AggLayer. And AggLayer is really like we refer to as a cross-chain settlement solution. The intention here is for any chain in crypto to be able to connect to the AggLayer. It's not just EVM chains. It's not just Polygon specific chains. It's anything, with the understanding that, again, I need people to be able to go from one chain to the other as easily as they can go from one website to another, and not need to worry about where their assets sit. It's irrelevant, right? All the account abstraction stuff. Just difference is AggLayer goes a little bit deeper than account abstraction. It does it more like the infrastructure layer. So once you assume that that's going to happen, what you then realize is, okay, well, we are going to be in this reality of thousands of chains. They are going to be built for specific purposes. And that means that Polygon is no different. We're not immune from that. When I look at Polygon POS, to believe that Polygon can be everything, and historically it's been pretty good at everything: gaming, DePIN, RWAs, payments, DeFi. Like, that idea, if we believe in what we believe in, is not real. That you're going to need to become specific something. So Polygon POS started focusing much more deeply about a year ago on like payments and RWAs as its core focus. And simple reason for that is when we actually started looking at the data, we realized that we were leaders in this category. And it was something that, frankly, because we were so distracted with all the many other things, we hadn't realized it. Once we started actually focusing on it, we started realizing that. But what's missing in this is DeFi. And when we think of something like the AggLayer, which has a cold start problem, right? You want tons of chains to come connect to it, but everyone's asking, why would I connect to it? Well, the best way to do that is actually to solve a problem that people have. And what people have is this problem where they don't want DeFi on their chain. Let's take a gaming chain as an example. I want to build great games, and I want my users to be able to experience great games. I want to build everything that I build for that purpose. But I do know that my users want to tap into a DeFi ecosystem somewhere. So I need to give that to them. Well, the best thing possible is to just be able to do that cross-chain in a very, very seamless way. So the AggLayer is built in a way that allows chains natively connected to the AggLayer by the end of this year to be able to go sub 5 seconds between chains and in a secure way and tap into another chain. So that all led to, we need to build a chain that can actually allow thousands of chains to tap into its liquidity without any problems. And we went and looked around all of crypto and thought, what chain could we bring to the AggLayer that actually is built for this purpose of having very deep liquidity that anyone could be able to tap into? And when you go and you look at what DeFi looks like today on any chain, you actually realize that it's built very poorly. And this doesn't matter whether it's Ethereum, Solana, Polygon POS, Arbitrum, across the board. The reason for this is because ultimately users care about two things. One of them is the deep liquidity we've been talking about. And the second one they care about is high yields. When you look at how this is solved on chains, it's literally not solved. Imagine how crazy it is when you think that most chains have 30 dexes and liquidity is shared amongst all of them. It would be like Binance saying, hey, here's 30 different order books you can choose from. And you're a market maker and you're going to like 2 or 3 of them. Like, bottom line is like that is much more shallow liquidity that can exist. So instead of having, Aave and Morpho and Euler on the lending side, or Sushi and Uniswap and Aerodrome and QuickSwap, and keep going down the list on like the DEX side, what Katana does is it actually effectively semi-enshrines one in each of these categories. So you'll only find one lending protocol. It's Morpho. You'll only find one spot DEX, which is Sushi. You'll only find one perp DEX, which is going to be announced soon. You'll only find one meme coin launchpad, which is called Kenze, which is effectively like launched by the team behind Impossible Finance, the launchpad. These are the only ones. What this allows now is for all the liquidity that wants to engage in lending to only go to Morpho. Deepens liquidity significantly more. Anyone who wants to execute a DEX trade goes straight into Sushi. So now you don't need to worry that like half the liquidity is in Uniswap and another 40% in Sushi and another 10% over here. 100% of it is in Sushi. So you get much, much, much deeper liquidity. That's the number one thing that Katana ends up solving, which solves it for the AggLayer in terms of needing that deep liquidity. And then the second part that Katana solves is that it looks at how do we actually have high yields that are sustainable? Because crypto is super good at high yields. It's terrible at sustainability high yields, right? So we can throw tokens out as incentives all day long. Every ecosystem eventually runs out of them, and they need to figure out how to continue growing when there's another ecosystem that has a token. So Katana's built, it has a token called CAT. There's emissions that go to like kickstart the ecosystem. All of these kind of core apps like Morpho and Sushi and the Perpdex and Launchpad allocate a portion of their tokens to incentives as well. That helps kickstart the ecosystem. It's brought in $400 million of TVL in a few weeks, but that's actually not the important part. The important part is other mechanisms that make this sustainable. So Katana has these three sources of what we refer to as like real yields. So one of them is actually using a protocol that Polygon built called Vault Bridge. So this is that all deposits of USDC, USDT, ETH, and BTC into the chain are actually deposited into Morpho vaults on Ethereum. Those assets are lent out, they earn yields. All of those yields go to incentivize those core protocols. Then similarly, you take all sequencer fees, because it's a single sequencer chain, and you go and you use all those sequencer fees to incentivize those core apps. Similarly, there's a stablecoin that is native to the chain that is Agora's stablecoin, AUSD. We get a very significant portion of the revenue that goes straight into this. And so what you get is these sources of yield that grow with size, they grow with activity, and you end up actually having all of that pushing liquidity into the core apps, and ultimately the users who deposit there and all the applications built on top of those core apps end up getting the benefit of those incentives. And now you actually have a sustainable ecosystem where you have deep liquidity, but then you also have higher sustainable yields than exist elsewhere. And that's the whole thesis behind Katana and how it helps like the AggLayer kind of solve this cold start problem.
Let me understand this further. So the AggLayer in principle is supposed to be aggregating liquidity and seamless account abstracted transition for users from any chain, EVM, non-EVM, across, right?
Yep.
Is that in place right now, or is it still in the works?
So the baseline version of the AggLayer, I'll call it like the infra, is in line. It is in place. So it allows, as of right now, going cross-chain between any EVM chain that connects to the AggLayer. We're now working on two things for the future, which is number one is doing that fast, because currently it's slow. It's like the speed of Ethereum, effectively. So very slow going between the chains. And then number two is being able to connect non-EVM chains is the next step. But currently you can go cross-chain slowly between these, which is not useful. And so we're kind of like waiting till we get kind of what we call fast interop to be able to go fast between these chains.
Okay. So when you say even within the EVM ecosystem, so suppose I, as a user, I have in my MetaMask, I've got any stable, let's say USDC on Ethereum. Now using the AggLayer, Katana's AggLayer, can I just simply switch chains and then deploy my USDC, which was on Ethereum, into say chain X's, a liquidity pool on chain X somewhere, or do a swap on another chain, for example, without having to physically, actually bridge my stables onto the other chain?
That's where we're going to be. So that's what I'm referring to in terms of like, right now we just have the infra built out. I kind of differentiate between the UX layer and the infra layer. We have the infra layer built out, right? So that allows for these different chains to come and connect. What we don't have right now is the UX layer, the part where you actually hide everything so that it feels like a great UX. What you just described is what we're building so that we get to a point where you can go fast without actually needing to pay attention to exactly the things that you were outlining to go between these chains.
Okay. All right. So it's very much sort of work in process, but there's a clear roadmap and plan for that, which I think, there's obviously been a lot of talk within the DeFi ecosystem, but once we have something which is really working, it fixes multiple issues, not just from a UX perspective, but actually even at core infra level, liquidity, fragmentation, for example, price impact, so many other things that kind of arise because of that.
Yeah, I think like what we did differently is that most ecosystems focusing on this issue have gone they focused on the UX first, which makes a lot of sense. They're like, hey, let's solve this, but without actually changing anything at the infra layer, right? And so what you end up doing is you use capital in an inefficient manner to be able to move capital quickly in a good UX, something like solvers, right? Which I think are really good solutions right now, but they're inefficient, right? From a capital perspective. Or you're doing some shortcut from an infra perspective where you're like, hey, I'm going to, mint a token over here and burn one over here. But who's controlling those tokens and what that looks like from a security perspective is not really optimal. We took the different path, which is the much longer, harder path, which is let's build this kind of infra portion that is much harder to build. And then we'll move up to the UX layer, which obviously just always takes longer when you build it that way.
Okay. All right. I'm parking that for now. I mean, the other thing that you mentioned about the way you're thinking about the Katana architecture is to fix the fragmentation by almost having very unified components of the DeFi stack. So you have one DEX, one lending market platform. Now, how will that happen? Is that going to be a sort of permissioned architecture, or what's the thinking around that?
Yeah, I love this question. So very intentionally, we cannot have a DeFi chain that is permissioned. From my perspective, that's not a DeFi chain. And so you need to build it in a permissionless way. Everything in crypto runs on incentives, right? From how blockchains actually are secured in the first place. And this is no different from my perspective, which is simply, it all comes down to incentives. So through tokens emissions, the bridge yield, sequencer fees, and the stablecoin revenue, all of those incentives go into those core applications. What this means is they're getting tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars a year of incentives from the chain. Now, if you are a competing DEX, why would you ever try to come compete with that? It makes zero sense to try to compete with that because you're going to lose. And so that's ultimately how it happens. It's in a permissionless way by being very opinionated. We are going to guide our incentives only to these core applications and through them so that no other application of that type can compete with them. And that's really it. So now you can get, what that allows is thousands of apps to build permissionlessly on top of them, but nobody wants to come and build competing apps because they just don't have a chance to compete given the capital. And even if they could compete, it doesn't make sense because the amount of capital they'd need to spend to compete would be so high.
And who decides what these core components, who these core components are going to be? And is that cast in stone?
Yeah. So this is, it's all decided by Katana Foundation. So Katana Foundation is jointly created by GSR and Polygon, who both incubated this project. And this is, we always say this, it's an opinionated chain and governance and decisions are completely opinionated, right? And so those decisions are made by Katana Foundation. In terms of, are those set in stone? The answer is mostly yes. And what I mean by that is that there are contractual agreements in place that give certain guarantees to these core applications. And realistically, once you have, even where we're at right now, $400 million of liquidity, I'm not just going to be yeah, forget you, Morpho. It's okay that there's $200 million, $300 million of liquidity over there. We'll just bring somebody else in. It's just not going to happen. And same thing on the sushi side. They have $100 million of liquidity there. I'm not going to be oh, cool, I just spent a huge amount of capital to bring you, like, help you grow over here and then push you out. So the only situation in which I view that changing is something existential, like some massive hack of one of these protocols that shows just a complete weakness in that protocol in some way. That would be a situation where we'd have like a really hard decision to make. And it's one of the risks that's being taken with this approach, which is, okay, now, XYZ app is one that can't be trusted anymore. How do we actually move away from that? And that would be like a really, really tough kind of question to ask ourselves and solve.
What happens to sort of innovation there in this kind of preferential selective routing? Are we not sort of creating in sort of almost an artificial framework for monopolistic DeFi components, and in some sense almost disincentivizing innovation?
Yeah, I've had this question a lot, so this is a really good one. Okay, so the way that I look at this is, if you said 2 years ago, could Katana have been built in this way? My answer would have been no. And the reason for this is because there was too much innovation left to be done in DeFi, such that doing this wouldn't make sense. The bet on Katana right now is that that's no longer true. If you look at lending markets, I think that the innovation that you're going to see on lending markets are going to be incremental. And when you have an incremental innovation, you now have two choices that you can make. You can either go to the incremental improvement and restart liquidity provisioning pretty much entirely, or you can stick with the thing that's slightly less efficient, but has much more liquidity. And I will bet on the deeper liquidity winning every time over the incremental improvement. Now, that is very different, right? If we were in a world where we were going to go from like V2 of a DEX to V3 of a DEX, where what we saw is like a massive improvement, you couldn't do that. And that's why I think 2 years ago, you couldn't do this. But when you look at like a V3 architecture to a V4 architecture, you're like, okay, the difference is hooks. Okay, hooks are a nice innovation, but like, is that really worth taking, like restarting the buildup of liquidity? And I think the answer is like, no, not at all. It doesn't make sense. And so I'd rather lose any kind of potential innovation than lose on liquidity. That's number one. Number two is we intentionally used protocols that are immutable. So Sushi has a immutable set of smart contracts. So technically anybody can run a front end for Sushi. So as long as those Sushi smart contracts are good, which they have a history of building good contracts, and using good contracts, that is something that we can rely on. And same thing on the Morpho side. Morpho has a very simple code base that is easy to audit. It's been audited a lot and has not had issues with it. And it's completely immutable, unlike other lending protocols that are mostly not immutable. And so we can just rely on these immutable code bases going forward, rather than needing to trust somebody with these protocols going forward. And so you take those two pieces, it kind of makes this decision a lot easier at this point in time.
Now let's talk about composability. When application protocols start building and they have these components, take ARNA protocol. We're building what we believe is better and advanced DeFi asset management, and creating a protocol for creating digital asset crypto structured products. And for running the protocol, I need the full DeFi stack. I need very efficient DEXs with the ability to run transactions without being front run. So we have to have MEV protection in some form. You need to have native oracles, natively deployed stables. You need to have lending borrowing markets for aggregating yield. So if you look at the entire stack, and various applications will be built on these 5-6 components, how are you going to attract protocols and builders like me to Katana? And how are we going to exercise choices or even aggregate options which are far better for the end user?
Yeah. So this is the thing that I think is actually the best part about Katana is actually the benefit to the apps built on top of the core apps, because you can go on and on about them. So number one is they are going to earn more yield for their users than they'll earn anywhere else. And I'm talking about real yield. Simple reason is if you take USDC yield and you look at what that's like on an L2 generally, it's pretty close to equivalent to the L1 yield. On Katana, because you're getting a portion of the L1 yield and the L2 yield, you're literally always going to have higher yield than what you would get elsewhere. So if you're an asset manager relying on Morpho and or Sushi, what you know is that at a baseline, you're getting higher yield than what you would get anywhere else, which then means your users are getting higher yield than they would get anywhere else. So that's number one. Number two is what you know is that you're on a chain that is built literally for deeper liquidity. What does that mean? Is that as an asset manager, you get less slippage than you would get anywhere else when you need to move assets in bigger size. And when you need to borrow, lend, you get more stability than you would get anywhere else, with all else being equal. So you get those benefits. But then on top of that, Katana is built in a unique way because it actually incentivizes uses of apps. So if you think of what happens with most ecosystems, people bridge assets, and most of those assets never do anything in a DeFi ecosystem. Or if they do, they start off doing something and then they stop doing something and they do nothing. The thing is, Katana actually disincentivizes this, incentivizes uses. And the reason is because if you're using USDC, USDT, BTC, or ETH, and you come to Katana and you sit there and you do nothing, you're literally getting farmed because your assets are being used on L1 to lend out, and you're earning none of the yield from that. You only earn it if you're actually using applications, and therefore you're actually incentivized to use these applications in a way that you're not incentivized to do otherwise. And so as an app, what you get is you get this ability to offer higher yields than you could elsewhere, with more consistent, let's call it pricing and better pricing than you get elsewhere, and a user base that is actually incentivized to use the applications. And so you're in a much better spot than literally you could be anywhere else. And that's why I think we haven't really had trouble bringing any apps to Katana so far. I think we've got probably 10 or 15 that are live right now on Katana after we're 2.5 weeks in. We've got another 15 that are deploying over the next few weeks. And so I think we're in a good spot, and people kind of recognize the benefits for their users of coming over to Katana.
Okay, that's awesome. Would love to kind of dig into it with my team, right after,
Cool.
sometime this week. Yeah, looking forward to that. And I'm just trying to kind of see some of the problems that sort of we face on other chains. I mean, or as a sort of asset management protocol. Clearly, MEV is one of them. And given the way you guys are designing the chain with very purposeful intent and being opinionated about it, and there are a lot of crypto bros who look at MEV as a market feature, which in my view, clearly it isn't. And I've had multiple conversations on this. It's essentially not a feature. It's something which allows front running, and there's no defense on that front, I feel. So how are you guys looking at making transactions on Katana MEV resistant?
Yeah, it all comes because it's a single sequencer. We have the ability to make very intentional decisions over what MEV is going to look like, right? So you don't really have a public mempool that makes this very public and everyone can see. But you technically still have the ability to kind of like abstract to have MEV on the chain. The way that we kind of approach this is literally a kind of consistent ordering that we don't actually make decisions on, right? So if somebody were to come to us and say, hey, I want you to order this transaction before that transaction, we would not do that, right? And so we have the ability to very easily control kind of a lack of MEV in a way that on an L1, for example, is like very, very difficult to do. Now, the difference that is a very important difference, is we are being trusted not to do that. And that is a very big difference, right? Which requires people to see those trade-offs, right? And this is why like I'm very open about this, because I think people should understand that. And if they're like, hey, we don't trust that, you know, Katana Foundation is not going to take advantage of us in the way that they're saying, then they shouldn't use the chain. But if they do, then it is a good environment where they can trust that they're not being taken advantage of the way that they might on an L1, even though it is more transparent generally.
Okay, all right. So we're introducing the whole element of trust here into what's supposed to be whole trustless architecture, and you know, and the trust is residing where on the Katana Foundation, which is Polygon Labs and GSR, essentially, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. But I do think this is obviously, having talked about L2s for a long time, I think this is one of the most interesting things to talk about. Is people introduce this, and I presented it as you need to trust us. The thing is, you actually need to do the same thing on an L1 as well. The only difference is you're trusting multiple parties instead of one. What I mean by that is there is always, like, you need to trust that a block builder is going to be willing to include a transaction, as an example.
Multiple parties is decentralization, right? So that
yes, except when the number is like 2 or 3. And if you look at like how most L1s are structured, or almost all of them, there's like 1 party or 2, maybe 3 that are actually playing the block building game. And they are making decisions about this. I'll give an example. We just saw, and I won't name who it is there's a block builder on Ethereum who somebody fat fingered a trade a few days ago and paid a huge amount for a transaction. That block builder refunded that user the amount that they fat fingered in the transaction. Now, here's a key difference. They just had to trust that block builder, who happened to be a random one of 3 block builders that basically exist on Ethereum, that they would actually refund them those fees. And that is the exact same trust that exists with a centralized sequencer that you would need to trust, with the only difference being that you can choose who the centralized sequencer is that you are trusting, whereas you can't actually choose who the block builder is that you're trusting, even though it's going to be only one of 3. And so I think ultimately, I'm not going to argue that like L1s are more decentralized. Of course they are. But I think when you actually start looking at the lower levels of infrastructure of L1s, you start seeing some degrees, and all of them, some degrees of centralization that make it that the centralization of an L2 isn't that different. Ultimately, when you look at somebody is making a decision on what they want to do, and this is no different on a decentralized L1 than an L2. The difference is you know who it is with an L2. You don't necessarily know who it is with an L1.
Okay, no, that's we'll see how this evolves. But yes, we've seen the concentration of really validators, especially with liquid staking, for example, having taken off, and so we know we understand that, and that those are sort of real challenges that have emerged in the whole concept of one of the major pillars, which is around decentralization. So yeah, the analogy that you're drawing between even L2s and L1s is a fair one. You can't deny that. So that's there for sure. Okay, so sort of moving on a bit to sort of the people and the plan, the execution. So you got a sort of a huge task and in front of you, and you've been Sandeep has, I think, gone on record with various restructuring that happened at Polygon, so putting the trust in you as one of the best CEOs in the entire ecosystem. So you got what's the dynamics between you guys, and what does Sandeep look after? What do you look after? And how is it panning out? And especially with Katana and Katana Foundation, can you sort of make it a bit more sort of open and transparent for all of us to understand.
Yeah, sure. So this has obviously evolved with time, right? But as CEO, there's a board that has always overseen what I do as CEO, right? And so historically, the way Polygon's kind of structured is there's a Polygon Foundation and then a Polygon Labs. And most of the time in most ecosystems, you see those as different. Actually, in the Polygon ecosystem, they're actually very much like the same in the sense that Polygon Foundation owns Polygon Labs. This is, by the way, very intentional because when you have that split structure between foundations and labs, you also have conflicts of interest that exist when it comes to extracting equity value out of the labs entity. That is not necessarily aligned with like the token holders. This is why it's completely eliminated at Polygon, and you actually just have complete alignment with Foundation owning labs. And so with that structure, historically, I've had a many-person board that overseed me and would make decisions strategically. And frankly, it took quite a bit of time often, which really slowed us down. And one of the things that kind of Sandeep's done in the last few months is kind of taken that away. And basically said, you know what, like instead of having this board that is making decisions by consensus, I'm going to take back control. And I'm going to drive decision making in a much faster way from a strategic perspective. Personally, it has nothing to do with like who the board members are not. This is like a much better way to operate. And we saw it like when we go back to 2021, just go look at what Sandeep did when it was Sandeep being Sandeep. He was able to go execute an incredibly fast pace, making fast, imperfect, but pretty darn good decisions. And Polygon became massive doing that. And when we created, I think, a more enterprise corporate structure, it slowed everything down. So a lot of this is Sandeep kind of like returning back to being able to make those quick strategic decisions. Now, as kind of CEO of Foundation and really controlling the board, he has the ability to make like capital allocation decisions from a strategic perspective and really make all kind of like key strategic decisions. Him and I are very, very close. We spend a lot of time together. So it's very easy for us to work together. I take care of just everything operational, engineering, tech, non-engineering on a day-to-day basis. And now with Sandeep in this role, nothing's changed in terms of like the time I spend with Sandeep because we've always spent a lot of time talking through like what we need to execute on, so on and so forth. But definitely the speed at which we're able to execute has changed like dramatically. And this is very like everyone in the org can feel it. It's just, and you can see it in what we're shipping. We ship things every couple weeks instead of shipping things every 6 months. And so that's really like the big difference in how we've kind of like fit together.
Right. Okay. No, that's very refreshing to hear, Mark. As a second-time founder and coming from a very different world before I got into DeFi and I founded Arna, I built out a consumer food company with a tech-enabled supply chain, all marquee investors from a very, Web 1, Web 2 world. And even after building, scaling, fundraising, and exiting that successfully, one of the things that struck with me was the inefficiency of the board structure and how outdated, outmoded boards are for newer businesses, and especially when we're building something in the decentralized ecosystem, something which is on-chain. Boards are almost a sort of a misfit in that. I forget being misfits in the in the conventional business ecosystem as such. So I totally resonate with that, and it's very refreshing to hear the restructuring, the changes that are have taken place at Polygon Labs and Polygon Foundation. So Katana is clearly going to evolve, from what I hear from you, Mark, as sort of the real DeFi ecosystem, the DeFi chain, and what happens to Polygon? What will be the focus for Polygon, and is there any conflict there? And how do you guys see the roadmap out there?
Yeah, so we always think of Polygon as focused on two things: AggLayer and Polygon POS. AggLayer is the North Star for Polygon. It's for the last like year or a little bit more than that even. It's what we spend our time focusing on. Our goal, if you really go back to like why Sandeep even created Polygon in the first place, the goal was always, people think of it as like scaling Ethereum. And there's no doubt that scaling Ethereum is part of what we're still doing. But it was always, Ethereum was Web3 back in 2018. But the reality is the goal has always been build a piece of infrastructure that allows for scaling Web3 to the size of the internet. And in 2018, Polygon POS basically was that. And frankly, when you look at 2021, Polygon POS onboarded everyone in DeFi, all the enterprises that wanted to come on, it enabled that. But when you really think of this multi-chain world, one chain no longer is that piece of infrastructure that scales it. So when we go to like the mission of like what we're trying to do at Polygon and really be that foundational piece of Web3 that allows it to scale to the size of the internet, that is really what the AggLayer does. So that's why it becomes like the North Star for what we do at Polygon. But also, again, in that framework, it's not really compatible to have the idea of Polygon POS is going to do everything. Because again, like in an AggLayer world, you don't need Polygon to do everything. And the second you don't need a chain to do everything, and you ask yourself, should I build this chain to do everything, or should I build it to be good at one thing? You immediately go, I should build it to be good at one thing. And people get confused by this because they say, well, block space doesn't look different if you do it for payments than if you do it for DePIN, than if you do it for gaming. And to me, that's like a very confusing statement because for like many reasons. One, block space does look different. If you're payments, you care about very, very fast finality, and you should spend resources trying to build a chain that provides the fastest finality possible in a way that doesn't matter for gaming. As long as you can give a pre-confirmation to a user in gaming and the transaction is going to fail 1 in 500 times, it doesn't matter. But you can't have that for payments. You actually need finality, non-failed transactions and payments consistently. That requires a chain that is built differently, one from the other. But I actually think the focus on block space is actually a mistake. It's actually the focus, period. And what I mean by that is it's the tooling that you build. So if you're building a general purpose chain and somebody says, is looking for a payments focus, who's more likely to have built more tools that make it easier for a payments company to come on chain and use the chain? The company that's trying to build tools for games, for DePIN, for DeFi, for payments, for RWAs, or the one who's only building it for payments? It's very obvious. The one who's only building it for payments, they're going to do a better job. And then you take this a step further and you say, okay, but what about when they want ecosystem connections, or they want to like grow a specific area in the ecosystem? Like, I want more liquidity in stablecoin X and Y as pairs. So you're a general purpose chain, you're sitting there and you're just like, hey, I'm trying to grow liquidity on a DEX in general. I don't care what pair it's in, as long as it's generating revenue for the apps and it's generating MEV and revenue for the chain. I don't care. But on a payments chain, people very much care about liquidity between stablecoin X and Y, for example. And that is way harder to execute on a general purpose chain. And then lastly, I'll call it on a cultural, social level, maybe. People do care. I give this example all the time that I was at a dinner in Hong Kong a few months ago, and I'm sitting next to somebody who looked mostly uninterested in being there, until I said, Polygon POS has started focusing exclusively on payments and RWAs. And suddenly the person perks up, starts asking questions, and 5 minutes later, he's like, hey, can you come to our office tomorrow? I want to talk through what we're doing. And now we've onboarded one of the biggest companies in China/Hong Kong to Polygon POS. It would have never happened if it was a general purpose chain. So these are like all of the reasons why you can build a better chain if it's for a purpose. And then you need the AggLayer in the background, because ultimately, if you are a payments chain, you still need those payments users to be able to access DeFi. And if they have a fun game they want to go play, they should be able to move their assets and go play that game very, very easily, which is why you ultimately need the AggLayer. But you should build a chain that's specific to an actual purpose that people are going to appreciate.
And whilst all of this is getting sorted out, either with incentives or as the sort of free markets would determine, what's your view as somebody who understands the law deeply in terms of the medium term? Let's take the next 3 to 5 years. How is law going to intersect with DeFi?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've already seen this play like a meaningful role just in general, right? Like in crypto. So I think one thing, like definitely like stablecoins have an important role in DeFi. And I think the Genius app just opened the door to many, many more stablecoins being brought into the world through institutions and otherwise. So I think we're going to see just a proliferation of stablecoins. Now that brings an interesting issue for DeFi, because what that does is you now have to solve a liquidity problem between many different tokens that are going to want to exist on many different chains. And so I think that's one way in which DeFi is going to be impacted, is thinking through, like, how do you deal with 150 different stablecoins, 200 different stablecoins, 500 different stablecoins from a liquidity perspective, where what you should assume is that even if Tether is going to continue to just be the leader, that you're going to assume that their market share is going to drop, that USDC's market share is going to drop, and these other tokens are going to play a meaningful role in some ecosystem. So that's number one, is like, how do you solve this hundreds of stable coins problem?
I want to understand from a legal perspective. For example, do you think KYC DeFi is something which will become more prevalent? I mean, sort of look into that. I mean, from how is law going to intervene in DeFi or converge with DeFi?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So I think there's a couple ways. So first of all, like, to the idea that we're going to be able to have like permissionless DeFi in a world where we're bringing in a bunch of like institutions is not like viable. Clearly, I think we've reached the point where DeFi within Web3, and maybe put it this way, DeFi within unregulated users is something that has become accepted. Like, I think it's like broadly true at this point. I think there's like a few untruths to that around the corners, but broadly that's the case. So really the interesting question is, what does DeFi look like when regulated people broadly want to come into DeFi? And I think there's zero doubt that you are going to need to have permission pools. This is something that's been tried for a long time, but I think like the current attempts are much more viable. So let's start with like just the lending side. The DEX side, by the way, is way more complicated. The lending side is much simpler, right? Because the big thing is if you can add to the supply, then at least you've got more collateral that can be borrowed against. And that can be done in a much more permissioned way, or even in a permissionless way, in the sense that you can allow anybody to actually deposit this collateral. It all comes down to how you liquidate that collateral, i.e., how does that collateral get into the hands of somebody who's like permitted to liquidate it instead of anybody liquidating it. I think that, call it permissioned liquidation role, is going to play a very important role in DeFi as you get more and more institutions coming into DeFi. I think there's a lot of discussion as to how the law intersects with people borrowing against that, let's say, the regulated collateral. I don't understand the issue there. There just isn't one that I have seen. As in, you are not touching those regulated assets. Why is it that the person who's issued that regulated asset cares, or even the regulated player cares, if somebody borrows against some collateral that isn't regulated as a person? It just doesn't matter. And so to me, it really, when you look at the lending side, it's the liquidation that is the permission thing that needs to be solved in the best way possible. And I think we already do like a decent job of this. The DEX side is much harder because ultimately there isn't this opportunity for some permission player and some non. It's everybody's interacting with everything. And so that's where you are going to need to see the growth of like specific permissioned liquidity. What that looks like, I frankly have no idea, because I don't think anyone's actually solved this well in any way whatsoever. And you see this every attempt at any kind of permissioned DEX environment is completely ineffective. And so I don't know what that's going to look like, but it's a problem that 100% needs to be solved. Now, there's still a benefit to this. Like, I'm not one who like loves permissioned environments personally. I'm like, I like to see things free flowing. But if I look at like, is there still a benefit? That's the question I ask myself. Is there still a benefit to this? And at a minimum, there is, in the sense that it doesn't prevent the ability to create liquidity in long tail assets in a way that AMMs allow you to do, and like order book based exchanges that have typically existed like don't allow you to do. So you still get this benefit of being able to have like long tail assets have kind of like liquidity. One way that you could use this as an example would be a DEX that is integrated into a centralized exchange. So let's take like sushi. Let's say that you have a DEX, you have a centralized exchange, and let's just take like Binance as an example, right? So you've got Binance, and it has its centralized exchange portion with, I don't know, 500 tokens. That is nothing compared to the number of tokens that is available on Uniswap. And probably the best way to actually ensure that you have the type of people who are allowed to trade on that is to say, hey, we're going to give access through our centralized exchange to these DEXs built with some kind of permissioned pool, but that anyone who uses our centralized exchange can add liquidity to that. So now what you get is a guarantee through somebody who has a huge number of KYC users that those people are actually properly KYC'd. And now you've got institutions who can come in to just these specific pools. It gets you away from what's often been done is like this institution to institution specific permissioning, which I think is a failure every single time. Like that doesn't work. You need something that is like retail plus institution that is being done in a permissionless way. And I think centralized exchanges are probably like the venue to actually making that happen rather than some new custom product.
It's clearly a contentious space in terms of how DeFi and the law will intersect. But the sooner things become clearer, the better. Some of it will be for the good. Some of it will take away or impact some of the primitives of DeFi. But we hope that it's sort of directionally going to be overall net better. Otherwise, not a great space. So, Mark, I started out by asking you about a 10-year perspective on how the ecosystem of the infrastructure at its core, multi-chain ecosystem will look like. And I heard you sort of being in the camp of the multiple, specific app chains, or, I'm not using the word app chains in the specific context, but yeah, chains which have specific use cases, but a few GPCs, general purpose chains, right? Now, as we come to an end, where do you see in 10 years as far as Polygon POS and Katana are concerned within that?
Yeah. As anyone who knows me knows, I like to win. And so the answer is there are going to be winners in each of their categories, like period. So I view Polygon POS as being the biggest payments and RWAs chain in the world. And when I look at Katana, I view it as having more productive TVL than any other chain. And I say that very specifically, being that I do not look at TVL as a number that matters. I view it as like the productive assets that are actually used. And that is a very, in my opinion, good proxy for how much value is going to be created in the ecosystem. And ultimately, if you build a chain from first principles, whether it's on the Polygon POS side or on the Katana side, for a specific purpose, people are going to be attracted to it, and you have an opportunity to build the biggest one. And that's specifically how I see that for Katana, whether it's on retail, institutions, or whales. And same thing for the payment side of things, regardless of like what payment vertical you are in. And last thing I'll say, I view both of them as just feeding the AggLayer. What's going to happen is a payments app is going to get too big for POS, fill up too much of its block space, want its own block space. It'll go create a chain that is on the AggLayer that can still tap into apps on POS if it wants, tap into Katana. Same thing with Katana. You'll get some DeFi apps that will become too big. They will then create their own chains on the AggLayer and continue to interact seamlessly with Katana and Polygon POS and the hundreds, thousands of other chains that will be on the AggLayer.
All right. So best wishes in the pursuit of that win. And it's been wonderful having you on Alpha Unashed. Thanks, Marc.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a fun conversation.